Welcome to all those kings, the good, the bad, and the ugly. This is our fourth class, and we're going to talk about a few of the early kings today. We have been talking about the book of Kings as being a fine source of apologetic material. If the Bible's not true, then we have a huge problem. If it's not historically true, we have a huge problem. And unfortunately, there are many what we would call liberal scholars over the last 50 years who have accepted many of our religious leaders, and in many of the schools, Princeton, Harvard, Yale, University of Chicago, Duke, all of the religious departments are composed of people who will argue that the Bible's not historically true, but it doesn't matter because it's a good book and it presents us with proper teachings. I contend that that is entirely wrong. Paul makes a very good quote here, that if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. In other words, if the foundation of Christianity, the resurrection of Christ, didn't actually happen as an historical event, then we're foolish for pretending that it did. And I like to paraphrase this and say if the Bible's not true, our preaching is useless. The Bible, from Genesis all the way up to the New Testament, is a historical record of how the world was being prepared for the arrival of Christ. It's not a period of time where people were just waiting for a Messiah. It shows step by step what God was doing to prepare the world so that when Christ arrived, his message could survive. And I've talked about that on a few occasions, but that's why I'm spending as much time as I do with these little apologetic details about the Book of Kings, because it's one of the better books for us to use to validate the historical correctness of the Bible. There are two books that deal with the kings. One is the Book of Kings itself, and the other is the Book of Chronicles. As a problem for us, as an apologetic problem, they sometimes seem to disagree or contradict each other, and the question is which one is right, and if these books are inspired, they aren't inerrant. The idea of inerrancy has gone by the wayside. There are obvious errors and contradictions and copying problems over the years, but the Bible is still inerrant, at least in its original form. And if these were inspired, how are we to deal with what appear to be discrepancies between the two? If we look at the book, I'm going to take one example of the difference between Kings and Chronicles. If we look at the Book of Kings, this is what it says about Solomon. We've been talking about this. Solomon followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Malach, the detestable god of the Ammonites. And then it goes on to say that the Lord became angry, and as a result, he was going to punish Solomon. He was going to punish the Israelites, and that led to the entire collapse of the northern kingdom and all of the events associated with Jeroboam. So the Book of Kings makes it very clear that Solomon descended into paganism and apostasy, and it created all of the problems that led to the destruction of Israel. If we look at the Book of Chronicles, however, what it tells us about Solomon, it says that King Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings of the earth. And then it goes on shortly thereafter to summarize his reign as saying, as for the other events in Solomon's reign from beginning to end, are they not written in various other records, one written by Nathan, one by Ahijah, and in the visions of Iddo, the seer concerning Jeroboam? In other words, they don't mention his apostasy, they don't mention his paganism, they don't deal with any of the events that were associated with the end of the life of Solomon. So which is correct? Well, the answer is they're both correct. The explanation for that, at this point, the conventional wisdom is that the Book of Kings was written as a contemporary record. This king had his reign, somebody wrote the history and added it to the list. The next king had his reign, they wrote the history and added it to the list, and so point by point, the Book of Kings is kind of a contemporary history. The Book of Chronicles, however, was written during the Babylonian exile, sometimes hundreds of years after these kings. It obviously drew on the Book of Kings because there are a lot of identical passages, but the Book of Chronicles was written by people from Judah. The northern kingdoms have been wiped out and they disappeared. Those are the so-called 10 lost tribes of Israel. You've heard stories about those. But the southern tribe of Judah was carried off into Babylon, and those are the ones that came back. The descendants of those exiles were the ones that came back. They're all Judahites. They're coming back to Judah, and they're writing a history about their Judahite genealogies, so that they knew what the properties were, they knew who the parents were, the lineages, all of that. And basically, if we were to put it in a contemporary term, they're applying a little bit of spin to it. In other words, they are not ignoring or contradicting things, but sometimes they'll leave things out. There are a couple of kings in which they add additional material, somewhat exculpatory. For example, Manasseh, who followed Hezekiah, and we'll be talking about him. It said he was so vile he made the streets run red with blood, and he was a paganist. But, and that's all it says in Kings, but in Chronicles it says he repented, the Lord forgave him, and the rest of his reign he restored the worship of the Lord. Well, we get that in Chronicles. Again, trying to make him look less offensive, perhaps. So the bottom line is we don't have to choose between the two. We need to regard them as supplemental to each other. And you put the two together and we get better stories of all of the men, better histories. Now, one other thing that we need to talk about, how did they keep track of all those kings? How do we put years to them? How do we know when they lived? If you have a series of men in two different lines of succession coming to the throne at different times and different periods of reign, it can get very confusing trying to figure out a way to represent those reigns if you don't have a continuous numerical chronology the way we do. We gauge everything year by year from the birth of Christ, and we can put a number on the next year, and whenever anybody does anything, we can just assign it to that year. Well, that's the anniversary system, and every man in this room has learned, sometimes to his detriment, that you need to remember anniversaries in this country. You have birthdays, Valentine's Day, first dates, first kiss. I mean, you go right down the line. There are a lot of anniversaries, but that's done year by year by year. They didn't do it that way. They used a different system entirely. Here's an example of one summary. It says, in the 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah, Baasha became king of Israel, and he reigned 24 years. Well, goodness, that's confusing. But if you look at it this way, the chronology of the book of Kings is remarkable in that it starts on the same day. Rehoboam and Jeroboam became kings at the same time. So we at least have a starting point for both lines. Jeroboam ruled for 22 years, so you can put it on the graph, and Rehoboam for 17, and those numbers are wrong, incidentally, according to the way we interpret them, not the way they recorded them. I'll get to that in a moment. But then you have Abiah, the son of Jeroboam, coming to the throne while Jeroboam's still alive. And he died while Jeroboam was still alive, and Asa became the king, who ruled for 41 years. Jeroboam died during the reign of Asa. His son only lasted 1 year. It says 2 there, but I'll explain that in a moment. And then it says that Baasha became king during the 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah, and he reigned for 24 years. So if you draw the graph out, it's not so confusing. But you can see how that one passage fits. You just draw a line and you can see where it fits into the graph that you've made. So it's very, very convenient, and that means that we should be able to confirm all of these dates. We have Solomon dying in 930. That's a good date. That's a solid date, and we know that the city of Jerusalem was destroyed in 586, beginning the Babylonian exile. That window of time there is the entire period of the divided kings. So that's so easy. We can show it because we know how many years that was, a total of 344 years. And we know that Rehoboam was the first king and Zedekiah was the last one, and so if we add up all of the years, one king after another, as mentioned in the Bible, they'll add up to 344, and we've confirmed the Bible, right? Well, the problem is, if you add them all up, they add up to 394 years. We've got 50 extra years in there. That means one or two things. Number one, the Bible's wrong. or number two, we are wrong in our interpretation of what's written in the Bible. And they weren't able to figure that out until about 50 years ago. A good German mathematician, Edwin Thiele, wrote a book called The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings, and this is a paperback version of it. Kind of a serious name, but basically he was able to sort out why there's a discrepancy between the totals and the actual numbers of years. And it's simply the way they count. How many years did a king reign? Regardless of the day that a king ascended the throne, all kings were given credit for a full year for each portion of a year that they were on the throne. That's very simple. That means if a king ascended the throne 1 month before the new year, which was in the fall, and then he sat on the throne only 1 month longer, he was on the throne how long? 2 months. But the Bible would say he was on the throne 2 years. That's all it means. The Bible is saying he was on the throne part of each of 2 years. That's all it's saying. It's not wrong. We do that with horses in this country. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that. I learned that in a lecture once. Every horse becomes a year older on January 1st. So if a horse is born in January, 12 months later he becomes a yearling. If he's born in December, 1 month later he becomes a yearling for the purposes of racing. And so there's a difference between horses that are bred for racing and horses that are bred for breeding. It's a lot cheaper to stud a horse for breeding because you can't racing. But it makes it easier to follow what's going on. You don't have to deal with birth certificates. And confusion about, is this horse really a yearling against another horse that's perhaps almost a year older? So every horse, this is that system. And that's all there is to it. Now, there were a few other things that play into it, but just this alone, if you have 20 kings, the year he died, he gets a year, and the new guy coming in that same year gets one, so every king change adds 1 year to the total, and that's 20 years right there. So the Bible's not wrong. It's just that we are trying to impose a modern chronological system on something that was written by a different culture 2,500 years ago. And so many mistakes have been made about the Bible because of that very reason. Okay, and that carries over into the New Testament too. How long was Jesus in the tomb? If you talk to most casual Bible students, they'll say he was in the tomb 3 days. Well, he wasn't. He was placed in the tomb shortly before the start of the Sabbath. He was tried first thing in the morning, immediately crucified. He died probably around 3 or so in the afternoon, but the Jewish day ends at 6 o'clock p.m. at sundown and runs for 24 hours to 6 p.m. the next sundown, which is confusing to me. I mean, if you're awake for until you go to bed, you're in 2 different days. We use the Roman system. They changed the day accounting at midnight. Everybody's asleep. You go to bed on one day, you wake up on the next. And that, to me, that's easier to understand. So Jesus was dead and had to be placed in the tomb before 6 p.m., the beginning of Sabbath. It was considered inappropriate to handle dead bodies. You'd become unclean if you handled dead bodies on the Sabbath. Well, the Sabbath started just a few hours after he was crucified, so they got him down off the cross, put him in the tomb, rolled the stone back, and got home before 6 p.m. So he was in the tomb 2 hours on Friday afternoon. He was in the tomb the entire time of Sabbath, sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday. That's 24 hours. Now, Sabbath ended at 6 p.m., but the women didn't go back to the tomb in the night. That would have been dangerous, if nothing else. I mean, women walking alone in the countryside. But they went back the next morning, probably 6 a.m., because this is the spring equinox. Sunrise was at 6 a.m. They went back shortly after 6 a.m., and the stone had been rolled away, and Jesus was risen. So, he had been in the tomb during all the dark hours of that day, 12 hours, which means he was only in the tomb 38 hours. That's not 3 days. But the Bible doesn't say 3 days. It says on the third day. Friday was the first day. He was in the tomb just a couple of hours. He was in the tomb all day Saturday, and on the third day, he rose. So you have to interpret things in the way they used language. And it's true, and it's correct. And you have to know these things for when you're challenged off at school. You go to high school or college and somebody says, this isn't true, that isn't true. You have to be able to say you're wrong. Here's the truth, and this is the truth. Okay, let's talk about kings of Israel now. I'm only going to focus on a few of the most important of the kings because most of them are unimportant. And we're going to focus for the next couple of weeks on the kings of the north because there wasn't much going on in the southern kingdom of Judah during that period of time. All of the threats, all of the challenges, all of the problems that were associated during the divided kingdom period were coming from the north. And so, unfortunately, it was the kingdom of Israel up north that had to deal with most of those problems. The southern kingdom was up in the hill country, and it was shielded by Israel. And as a result, things didn't begin to happen down in Judah until the Assyrians came in and wiped out the northern kingdom, and now they could begin to focus on the southern kingdom. So we'll talk about the northern kings. Just as an overview, there were 19 kings of Israel from 930 until Samaria was destroyed in 723. And incidentally, you'll see 722, 720. It was almost a 3-year siege. Absolutely horrible, with women eating babies and terrible things. And so some will give you a date for when it started, and some will give you a date when the city finally fell. So you'll see different numbers. But around 720, Assyria destroyed the northern kingdom. There were 19 kings during that period of time, which is just a little over 200 years. It was chaotic up there. They had assassinations, they had coups, they had intrigues, they had all kinds of problems from the north. It was simply chaotic. By contrast, down south in Judah, you only had 20 kings during the entire period of time. That's only one more than up north, but the southern kingdom survived for almost 350 years. In other words, almost 150 years longer, and they didn't have any more kings. So the kings who were reigning managed to live a little longer and have somewhat of a less unstable period of reign. All of the kings of Judah were of the line of David. David, son, a grandson, a great-grandson, right on down, except for one brief interruption. For 7 years, there was a pagan woman who was the daughter of Ahab from the northern kingdom who sat on the throne in Jerusalem for 7 years. Most of you probably aren't familiar with that because it's just a couple of paragraphs in the Bible, but the way that happened is fascinating, and why they've never... She was a monstrous woman. Slaughtered her family, her grandkids to take the throne. We'll talk about that because it's fun. I like to... Now, the kings of Israel, here they are. Here are all 19 kings. And as they print out, you'll notice some names are indented. Each indent is the son of the man just above. And you'll notice there are a lot of kings listed that don't have sons or grandsons that survived them. It was very chaotic. They all practiced, incidentally, the sin of Jeroboam all the way down, and each year it became more paganized. Jeroboam took the throne, lived a normal life. His son Nadab took the throne, survived about a year, and was assassinated by a guy named Baasha. And you see him right below Nadab. Baasha survived, ruled for 20-some years. His son Elah took the throne, and he was assassinated by a fellow named Zimri. Zimri lasted 7 days and burned himself up in the temple. Omri took the throne. When he died, his son Ahab, which we're going to spend quite a bit of time with, took the throne. Ahab died in battle, which is neat. He was a war horse. He ruled for 20-some years. He died in battle, which is what a king's supposed to do. His son Ahaziah took the throne. His eldest son fell through the roof of one of the buildings, got severely injured, and died. And so Joram took the throne, ruled for a little while, and was assassinated by Jehu. Jehu is the only line of kings that survived for a reasonable period of time, all the way down to his great-great-grandson Zechariah, who had just taken the throne and was assassinated by Shallum, who was assassinated by Menahem. Menahem's son was assassinated by Pekah, who was assassinated by Hoshea, and then Hoshea succumbed to the Assyrian invasion, and the city of Samaria was destroyed. So you can see that job security was not a high point in this particular line of kings. And we're going to talk about just a few of these. Most of these are fairly unimportant. Jeroboam we've talked about because he's the one who initiated the pagan worship that was practiced all the way through. Omri is important because he's the one that built the city of Samaria. Very important city throughout that entire period of time. It's the area in which the group of people that are called Samaritans existed, and we'll talk about how that came to be. The Samaritans were up here in the northern kingdom all the way down to the time of the New Testament and Christ, where they were despised and reviled by the Jewish population of Jerusalem. Ahab is perhaps the single most important king in the northern kingdom. We get very little about him personally, but he's very important for a specific reason. And Jehu is very important because he's the one that wiped out Ahab's family. But the reason Ahab and Jehu are so important is because they're both mentioned in Assyrian records. We actually have an engraved picture of Jehu, an early photograph, basically, on a relief. It shows an Israelite king bowing down. It shows the proper attire, and it shows him before the Assyrian king. That's Jehu. This is gold. Finding the names of biblical figures in Assyrian and Babylonian records is invaluable in apologetics. And so both of these men are extremely important. So those are the ones we're going to talk about. Also, Ahab lived at a time when he was being contested by a prophet named Elijah. This is the time of Elijah, very important prophet. And if you start reading about Ahab, you get a little bit about him, and then you get page after page of the lives of Elijah and Elisha. Two very important prophets, so we'll deal with them a little bit as well. Okay, I wanted to show you how this all plays out. Jeroboam was king for 21 years. And incidentally, the numbers that I'm showing you are probably all less than 1 year, are 1 year less than what you read in the Bible, because Thiele makes the adjustments. These are actual dates. If it says they were king for 22 years, it was really 21. Remember, you have that half year extra that you get. He died, and his son Nadab took the throne. The Bible says he reigned for 2 years. He only reigned for a year, and probably much less than that, and the Bible tells us why. He was assassinated by a fellow who wanted the throne, a man by the name of Baasha. And the Bible says Baasha struck Nadab down at Gibbeton, a Philistine town, while Nadab and all Israel were besieging it. The Philistines were still a challenge. They were down along the coast. Israel was up in the hill country. And they were always fighting about the foothills and the territory in between. But apparently, Nadab took the throne. He's a brand new king. He's a young man. He's trying to show he's a warrior king. He and the army go down, and they're attacking this city. And one of the men in the army, Baasha, who was probably one of the top military officers, struck Nadab down and assassinated him. Now, apparently that met with approval because he was allowed to reign for the next 20-some years. But what did Baasha do after he killed Nadab? It says he killed Jeroboam's whole family, destroyed them all. Men, women, children. Nadab was the son of Jeroboam. But if Jeroboam had other sons or grandsons in that line, they could come back to Baasha and say, we are entitled, we're the heir, we're of the line of Jeroboam, you're not an authentic king, and it would be a challenge. So what he did was go through and wipe out everybody who was even remotely related to Jeroboam. Wiped out the grandparents, the aunts, the uncles, the sisters, probably friends, anybody who was associated with Jeroboam's reign, including Nadab and all of his family. And that actually is in fulfillment of a prophecy that was given to Jeroboam. You may recall that when Jeroboam established his false gods in his 2 temples, his son got sick, and his wife went to one of the prophets at Shiloh, Ahiah, and said, what's going to happen to my boy? And the prophet said, here are the words of the Lord. I want you to take them back and tell Jeroboam, he told the wife. Because of the sin of Jeroboam, I will burn up the house of Jeroboam as one burns dung until it's all gone. They were told at that time that eventually the house of Jeroboam would be wiped out for its sin, and that's what Baasha was doing. He was fulfilling that prophecy. Baasha ruled for 22 years, died apparently of natural causes. We don't know how he died, but his son Elah took the throne, and notice he was on the throne. He was only on the throne really during 1 year. Again, probably just a few months until one of the challengers shows up, and he was assassinated by a fellow named Zimri. And we're told who Zimri was. It says Elah, the son of Baasha, was getting drunk in the home of the man in charge of the palace. Now this is kind of fun. I mean, you're looking at all the nitty-gritty of these stories. Tirzah was a dinky little town up in the hill country. When they call it the palace, it was probably the house that the king lived in, but it was just a bigger house. If you look at the foundations and the ruins, these are not great big palaces, elegant, that we think of. And they would have a major domo or a chief butler or somebody who's supervising it. And Elah and his chief butler are sitting there having a few beers, maybe talking about the Super Bowl and enjoying themselves. And it says that Zimri came in, struck him down, and what did he do? He killed off Baasha's whole family for the very same reason that Baasha wiped out Jeroboam's family. He didn't want anybody related to Baasha to come back in a year or 2 or 5 and say, I'm the legitimate heir. So he wiped out that whole family. Again, you can see it's not a very good thing maybe to even be related to the king. Now, Zimri only lasted 7 days because apparently they didn't like him. It says when the Israelites heard, now these are the people of Israel, not the people down in Judah, the people in the new kingdom of Israel. When they heard that Zimri had murdered the king, they proclaimed Omri, the commander of the army, king over Israel that very day. Now the army's still down here at Gibeton. We read about that. I've edited that out. Zimri's gone up. He's killed the king. They hear about it down here, and they go rushing up to Tirzah to take care of business. And they arrive just a few days later and lay siege to the palace in Tirzah. Zimri notices that the jig is up, so to speak, and what does he do? He went into the citadel of the royal palace and set the palace on fire around him. So he immolated himself. He committed suicide. He was only king for 7 days, but it gave him enough time to wipe out the family of Baasha. So now the family of Omri is going to be taking the throne and will survive down through Ahab and a few others.
Who's Omri?
Omri is the head. He's a military leader. He's one of the top generals for the Israel, and I edited that out as well. I'm sorry. So Omri, as a military leader, had the support of the army. They went up and took care of Zimri, and now Omri, after a couple of years of challenges and so forth, was able to take the throne. He decided that it was necessary to have a more impressive and perhaps a stronger, more secure capital, and he bought a hill. It's called the Hill of Samaria, and he built the city on the Hill of Samaria. He called it that after Shemer, the name of the former owner of the hill. In other words, there's this big hill very near the international trade routes. He built this big city, and it was the capital, destroyed by the Assyrians, eventually rebuilt by Herod the Great, and was a major city during the New Testament times. Now, if we take a look at the map, here's how that all plays out. Judah and Israel created 2 much smaller kingdoms within the territory that had been controlled by David and Solomon, especially Solomon. And as the years passed, because they were both weakened, all of the conquered areas around them were able to break free. And their extended territories that were controlled are gone, and they had to contest with all of the local tribes and groups around there, for one thing. But Jerusalem was located at the northern end of Judah, and Samaria was located right in the center of the new kingdom of Israel. And it was located there primarily because it's very close to the international trade routes. All of the commerce traveled up and down that road along the coast because it's a lot easier to travel that way. And as a result, in Israel, they were exposed to all of the international influences as well, all the various pagan gods, all of the various religions, and each year the kings would adopt more of these pagan gods, and the situation in Israel became worse and worse. In fact, it says each of the kings was worse than all those who reigned before him. And you see that. It's because they keep adding to the number of gods, the pagan gods. This is a picture of an excavation that was done at Samaria. This is dating back to the time of Ahab and the northern and Omri. And you can see retaining walls. It was pretty impressive construction up on top. And it was a substantial fortification as the center of the kingdom of Israel. At this point, geopolitics of the region are changing dramatically. When Solomon took the throne, there were no outside challenges, not up in Turkey, not in Mesopotamia, not in Egypt. They were able to conquer all of the small kingdoms around them, and they had a sizable kingdom that they controlled. But this is changing. The first thing that happened is that they broke into two pieces. And they ended up fighting among themselves, which greatly weakened the individual. So the sum of the two was a lot less than the original was. And at the same time, Egypt was beginning to recover in international strength and was posing a problem regularly from the south. The various groups, cultures that they had conquered, such as the Ammonites, were a problem. The Moabites broke free and were attacking from time to time. The Edomites, same thing. All of these smaller kingdoms, which are now freed up, are posing a problem to Israel and Judah. In addition, some people that had been subjugated by David, the Arameans, you'll find during the time of Ahab, all of a sudden they're fighting Arameans, and that's because the Arameans, who are centered around the modern city of Damascus today, are now rising into their own power. And they're posing a problem. So they're constantly attacking Israel and or Judah. They went back and forth and they created all these silly alliances. But the Assyrians, during this period of time, were spreading westward out of what would be modern Iraq all the way to the Mediterranean. And they conquered the Phoenicians and the area of that would be Syria, northern Syria, and within 100 years of the time of Ahab and his successors, they would eventually launch an attack on Israel and completely destroy the kingdom of Israel. So this is what's coming on. Not only have they divided into two weaker kingdoms, but they now have increased threats on all sides. And all of this, according to prophecy, was organized and orchestrated by the Lord. The Lord says we're going to destroy Damascus, we're going to destroy Samaria. I'll use the Assyrians as a tool, but then I'm going to destroy the Assyrians. All of this is in the Bible, and we'll take a look at that as we go. But once the Assyrians have conquered that area, one of the problems is they attacked Jerusalem, failed, but for the next 125 years, the kingdom of Judah is a tiny little island up in the hill country surrounded by the Assyrians and forced to pay tribute and to subjugate itself to the Assyrians. And that's what we read about after the destruction, from Hezekiah all the way down to Josiah. So bad times, difficult times for all these people. Question back there.
Judah was only 2 tribes to 3 tribes. How did they control such a massive piece of land where the northern Israel was 10 tribes and had, I think by map, you've got 10 tribes versus 2 tribes. There's a greater number of people to defend the northern country versus the southern. How did Judah maintain its territory with less people?
Yes. The question was, if you didn't hear it, how did Judah have so much territory since they were a single tribe? Actually, they had the tribe of Simeon inside and the little tribe of Benjamin to the north. Why did they have so much territory compared to the northern kingdoms? And the answer is most of the tribe of Judah was very arid land down in the Negev. There just weren't any people down there. Now, once the Assyrians conquered everything down the coast and on the east side of the rift, they also controlled that southern area, and Judah was relegated to a tiny little area up in the hill country. But most of that was highly unpopulated land because it was just so dry.
Thank you.
Okay. I think what we'll do is we'll stop there. Next week we're going to talk about Ahab, nasty guy, and we're going to talk about the prophet Elijah and the contest between the two of them, and we're going to bring into our discussion the iconic evil woman of the Bible. We're going to talk about Jezebel. So you're not going to want to miss it, and I think at this point we can take a couple of questions if anybody has any. We do have a little time.
John,
Yes.
What was the name of that bad queen that was on the throne for 7 days?
Athaliah. Athaliah, you may want to read up on that. She was a daughter of Ahab and a granddaughter of Omri, but she might have been, we don't know that, but she could have been a daughter of Jezebel on the throne, on David's throne in Jerusalem for 7 years. Truly nasty woman. And it's a fun, these are wonderful stories, and nobody ever made one of those Bible movies that we had growing up. But this would make a marvelous series on television. You just take it through. These are nasty people, and the plots and the scheming, it'd be wonderful, but nobody has seen fit to do it. Question?
How did she so successfully interrupt the lineage of David?
Well, I'll be talking about that in a little more detail, but she was the mother of one of the kings, and when that king died, his little grandson, or her grandchildren, one of those grandchildren should have become king, but she wiped out all the grandchildren so she could take the throne. She missed one. That was Joash. She missed one little baby that was hidden away, and as he grew up, they were able to take the throne back for him. But she was a pagan woman from up north. She was the daughter of Ahab from start to finish, and she was perfectly willing to wipe out all of her grandchildren so that she could seize the throne. Isn't that a wonderful? Wouldn't that make a great TV series? I mean, you just have to.